Hello and welcome to episode 44 of the Insider's Guide to Project Cars 2, where today we will be taking a look at the director and broadcaster modes. We'll be taking a look at how they actually work and discussing that, along with the various different options and features within either of the two modes and how they all kind of work in unison with each other. So this kind of follows very nicely on from last week's episode, where we took a look at the replay, monitor and spectator systems, as a lot of the features and functionality here in the director and broadcaster suite are shared with that as well. They work in a very similar way, but we will go through those here in this episode too, just at a quick glance. The main difference though, that the director and broadcaster suites actually separate themselves from the regular monitor and spectator systems, is that these director and broadcaster modes are actually aimed for producing high quality, high level broadcasts and live streams of esports events, league races, organised community races, or if someone just fancies just broadcasting out a live stream of a regular public lobby from a spectator point of view, they can also do that as well. But the director and broadcaster systems are tied in together rather nicely to kind of bring this whole professional package and give the viewer the best and most informative live stream experience that they can possibly get. Now, in order to actually access the director and broadcaster modes, you first need to be assigned either the director or broadcaster role, and this is done by the host of the multiplayer lobby. Now, what the host of the multiplayer lobby should actually do whilst actually setting up the multiplayer lobby and putting in all the race settings, the session settings, choosing the track and cars, for example, they should also go into the host settings and enable the broadcaster mode in there. It's highlighted here on the screen, and what that will do when enabled is allow for an extra 2 slots, one for the director, one for the broadcaster, and it won't take away any of the race slots. So when setting up a lobby with 32 drivers, which is the maximum number of drivers that you can get in a multiplayer lobby, if you don't have this option enabled and you add a director and a broadcaster to the race, you will take away 2 of those grid slots. So you only be able to have 30 drivers and then the director and broadcaster to make up the total of 32 players allowed for that lobby. However, actually enabling the option will allow you to retain all 32 drivers and then get an extra 2 slots for the director and also broadcaster roles. So you will have a total of 34 players rather than the regular 32. Of course, when it comes to console and you're adding the director and broadcaster, the same thing works here. However, the console limit is 16 drivers, so enabling this option will allow you an additional 2 slots, which will allow you up to 18 people, which will be broken down into obviously 16 driving and then the additional 2 slots for a director and broadcaster. Now, both these slots don't necessarily need to be filled. However, if you don't fill one of the slots or don't fill either of the slots, it will not grant you an extra driver. You are locked to 16 drivers on console, 32 drivers on PC, even if you enable the broadcaster option. Now, when it comes to having the 2 roles in the lobby, you will always need a director before you can have a broadcaster. You cannot have a broadcaster without a director. You can, however, if you really wanted to, have just a director flying solo without a broadcaster, but the director will always come first. The main reason for this is the way that the 2 roles actually work. The director is meant to essentially direct the live stream. He has all the information, all the camera controls and all the functionality controls on their screen. They basically choose what the broadcaster will end up seeing, and the broadcaster's role is essentially to live stream their perspective out to the audience. It's generally a lot less clutter-free. They don't have all the controls on their screen, therefore they're a lot more limited and will only see what the director actually wants them to see. And essentially what that will allow the broadcaster to do is then focus on essentially just commentating and reacting to what they're actually seeing. So the director can also commentate as well, and if they wish they can also actually live stream from their perspective as well if they want. However, they will have the kind of the various different views, the controls on the screen as well, whereas the broadcaster won't. So the broadcaster, the screen and the UI on the broadcaster mode is much more suited and a lot clearer for actually live streaming, and just gives a much better quality presentation. Now, actually coming back to how to actually assign a director or broadcaster in the lobby, essentially what the host will need to do is, in the player list, when they're in the lobby before they actually launch the first session, they will need to pick the player that they wish to assign to the director role and the player that they wish to assign to the broadcaster role, and that player will then receive an invite for the role that they have been selected to take on. Now, they obviously have the choice to either accept or decline that invitation. If they accept, then obviously they then become that respective role that they have been indicated or assigned to, and obviously if they decline, then they remain as one of the 32 drivers. Now, once the lobby is actually launched and you go into the first session, the director and broadcaster will immediately launch into their respective suites. They will not appear in any of the garages, nor will they appear in any of the result sheets. If the director or broadcaster was to end up disconnecting from the lobby for whatever reason, when they rejoin back into the lobby, they will also rejoin straight back into the director or broadcaster suite, whichever role that they're actually assigned to. So they do not lose that role, they do not lose that position that they were in, and can therefore resume live streaming or directing from either of those two modes. Now, a lot of the gameplay that you've been seeing in the background has mostly been from the director suite, and this is essentially all the controls and UI elements that the director has available to them to choose and display on the broadcaster screen. So actually quickly going through the various different UI controls that we have here. Over on the left hand side highlighted, we have the leaderboard UI. Up the top there we have the overview, and then down the bottom we have the various different camera controls with the different views, and then the various different information overlays and features along with the race feed. Now, if we bring up what the broadcaster will see here on the right hand side and put them side by side, you can see that the broadcaster is watching exactly the same player, the same gameplay, and the same views as what the director sees, because the director has complete control of what the broadcaster is going to see. However, as you can see as well, the broadcaster doesn't have the camera control panel down the bottom, nor does it have the ability to bring up the additional UI elements. It literally has what the director has chosen the broadcaster to be able to see and displayed on their screen. So the broadcaster screen is obviously a lot less cluttered in terms of UI. There's a much clearer picture in terms of being able to view the racing action, and is therefore just generally a lot better and more suited for the actual role of live streaming out to an audience and focusing on the commentary, whereas the director can use the various different like leaderboard elements and also the race info feed down there in the bottom right to get an idea as to where the battles are happening on track and what kind of stuff to be focusing on, and choosing what camera position is going to be best to display that action. So if we go through the various different pieces of UI elements and information that is displayed within each one here in the director, we'll talk about how they work over in the broadcaster mode as well. So starting off on the left hand side in the red highlighted box, we have the standings panel, and this shows the position of the drivers in the session or race. The first set of numbers down the far left hand side in the light bluey grey colour background with the numbers inside, that is the overall position of the drivers, and any numbers that have a red background, in this case third position and also 20th position, that indicates that that driver has received a penalty, whether it's a grid penalty in a qualifying session or whether it's a time penalty usually applied in a race. Coming just to the right of that, we have the driver's 3-letter tag, which is set up by them, either taken straight from their gamer tag on their respective platform, or whether it is something that they have set up in their driver profile and in their competitive racing license. They can edit and adjust those there. but this essentially allows the director and broadcaster to identify the drivers. And then next to the right in the third column you have the car class tag, which identifies which car class that driver is racing within. To the right of that you then have the class position. Obviously this is a single class race where all the drivers are in the GT3 car class, and therefore all the positions are completely identical to the overall position. However, if it was a multi-class race, then obviously the positions of the drivers within each class will be indicated here. Now to the right of that with the white numbers, that indicates the driver's previous lap time that they have set within the current race. If it's a qualifying or a practice session, then it will display the fastest lap time that the driver has set rather than their previous lap time. And then just to the right of that we obviously have the indicator to display what lap that the leader is on, and then the gap between each driver to the overall leader. It's not the gaps between each driver individually, so keep that in mind when trying to pick out drivers who are in battles. Now to actually aid with picking out these drivers who are within close proximity to each other and potentially battling for position, you have the little exclamation mark indicator, which is there placed on the far right hand side, right on the very end of the leaderboard element, and you can see that a number of drivers actually have this indicator next to their name. That essentially means that the driver is within roughly about a second to a second and a half to the driver immediately in front of them, and is aimed at helping the director find the on-track action and pick out the drivers actually battling for position. Now this exclamation mark icon will disappear once the drivers have a gap more than a second to a second and a half, and there is also a pit icon that will appear in the same place for any drivers who go into the pit lane, and highlights that to the director and broadcaster as well. Now typically this is left on for both the director and broadcaster by default. However, if the director chooses to disable the standings panel for the broadcaster, they can click the standings button down there in the bottom left, and that will hide the UI element. Generally though, it is best to keep it up there, as the broadcaster likes to feed off of that information and commentate on some of the potential battles, look at the gaps, and kind of help the director a little bit as to where they want to be focusing and commentating on certain drivers at what time. So generally it's best to leave the standings panel on, as well as the overview, which is displayed up in the top center of the screen and highlighted in red as well. Now in this element we have the current lap number versus the total number of laps. Alternatively, if the race is a timed race or a practice or a qualifying session, it will display how much time is remaining in that session or timed race. And then obviously it highlights the driver that is currently being watched with their full name. And immediately in the center below that, in the little blue section, we have that driver's current position and then also the car class that they are racing within as well. Now just to the left of that little blue element you have the driver who is in the position ahead of the driver that you are currently watching with their full name, and the gap between the driver that you are currently watching and that driver in the position ahead. And then to the right of the blue element on the other side you have the driver who is in the position behind, again with their full name, and then the gap between the driver who you are currently watching and that driver in the position behind. Now this is also another element that is switched on for both the director and also broadcaster by default. However, it can be toggled on and off with the overview button down there in the bottom left as well, highlighted in the red square, and that will obviously then disable it for both. But generally it's another one of those important pieces of information that is generally left up and is useful for both the director and also the broadcaster to feed information off of, and therefore help commentate on the racing action. Now there is one final element that does feed info with regards to the drivers' positions, names, and also the gaps, which is the splits element. And by default this is turned off for both the director and broadcaster. However, the director can enable it if they so wish. It will not appear on the director's screen, so when they click that button and it turns yellow to indicate that it's switched on, they will not see it themselves. However, it will appear at the bottom of the broadcaster screen as indicated here, and this essentially feeds the same sort of information as the standings and the overview with regards to the drivers' positions, their actual names, their car classes that they are in, and then also the gap between each driver's position and the actual leader as well. The gap is between that driver and the leader, not between each individual driver. So with that, and when it is enabled, the broadcaster is able to scroll through that list and look at the various pieces of info for the relevant drivers that they wish to view. The director has no other control over that splits element other than enabling it and disabling it for the broadcaster. So that is something that is in the broadcaster's hands once the element has actually been switched on. Now, continuing on with other UI elements that contain various other pieces of information, down in the bottom right here we have a speedo, we have a map, and we also have a timings button. Clicking on the speedo button will bring up a speedometer, and with that we are able to view various different pieces of information for the driver that we're currently watching. So we can see here the brake and throttle inputs, although they are slightly delayed and smoothed out. They're not quite 100% accurate to kind of mask their inputs and not give away too much information. We can see the driver's gear, we can see the driver's speed and RPM. We can also see roughly how much fuel they have in their fuel tank, although again it's not 100% accurate either. There is a slight delay in the fuel's depletion. It's not 100% live, whereas obviously the driver actually racing will see it live and a lot more accurately. We can also see the rough engine temperature, and we can also see what driver aids the driver is also using as well, whether they're using traction control, ABS, and also stability control. Now, when the director enables this, it will also be shown on the broadcaster screen as well down there in the bottom right, so both the director and broadcaster can see this piece of information. However, the director has control as to when it is displayed and when it is hidden. Next to the speedo option, we have the ability to bring up the track map, and that essentially shows the map of the track and the position of all the drivers around the circuit as well. The driver currently being watched will be indicated with the blue triangle. Any other drivers who are on the same lap or the lead lap will be indicated with the white dot, and then any drivers who have been lapped and are a lap down on the driver currently being watched will be indicated with a blue dot, and any drivers who are a lap ahead or have lapped the currently being watched driver will be indicated with a red dot on the track map. And again, it works in the same way as the speedo. The director can choose to turn the map on and off. It will be displayed for both the director and also the broadcaster at the same time, so both can feed off of that piece of information. And then the final UI element down here on the bottom is the timings, and this will give us a much more detailed overview of the drivers in the race, where we can see the driver's position, their car class, and also the position in a class. We can see the driver's name, what lap they are currently on, the previous lap time that they have set, their best lap time that they have set so far in the race or in the session. We can see the gap to the overall leader, the current status as to whether they are actually on track and racing or whether they are in the pit lane or have retired. And then we can also see the overview of any driver penalties. So if they've got a grid penalty, it'll be displayed here along with any time penalties, and actually indicate and show how much time that driver has accrued in time penalties. And we can also see a little ping indicator here as well to indicate how good their connection strength is. So once again, this is something that the director can bring up for both the director and also the broadcaster to see. It does fill up a large portion of the screen and can obscure the racing action, so it is generally best reserved for using when the action is a little bit quieter, and is mainly used, or is best used, for finding out what penalties certain drivers actually have obtained during the qualifying session or during the race, and getting an overview of that as well. Most of the other information can be gathered from the other UI elements other than the last lap and best lap. Obviously the last lap is there indicated in the standings panel, however the best lap during a race is not indicated there in the standings panel as well. So you can also gather that piece of information from here in the timing screen. Now, above this control panel, we have the various different views that the director can flick between, and we've got locked views with the cockpit, the chase, the roof, the bonnet and bumper camera. Selecting one of those, the gameplay will remain in that camera, or the view gameplay will remain in that camera for the driver who you are currently observing, and it will not change until the director chooses to switch to another camera view. Over to the right of that, we have the rotating views, and we've got an onboard option which will cycle between all the different locked views that are there available. So it will cycle randomly between the cockpit, the chase, the roof, the bonnet and the bumper cam. It will switch between these every 10 seconds or so, and it will do so in a random order as well. And then to the right of that, we have the trackside option, which is your more standard replay cameras, where you have various different cameras from the trackside, viewing it from various different perspectives, which will have various different field of views. It will zoom in and out, the cameras will move up and down track cars, and provide some nice racing action shots as well. And then the final camera view is the all option, which will switch between onboard and trackside rotating views, and it'll do so randomly. So it may do, say, 10 seconds in the chase cam, it then may do 10 seconds in the bonnet cam, and then switch to 10-15 seconds of the trackside replay cameras, and then possibly jump back to the bumper cam, and then back to trackside again. It all does it in a random order, and again it's on like a 10-15 second cycle as well. So those are the camera options that the director is able to switch between. The broadcaster doesn't have control of this, so this is all down to the director, and the director gets to pick and choose what camera angles the broadcaster is going to be watching the action from. So it's down to them to pick which angle they think is going to be best to highlight and showcase the racing action for the broadcaster to then put out to the live stream and obviously commentate over the top of. And as you've probably seen in the gameplay in the background, we've been cycling through various different views trying to capture the racing action from various different camera angles and create a nice, interesting and high quality experience for the viewer. Now, the final piece of information that is only available to the director, is not available for the broadcaster, is the race feed down the bottom there, and that essentially highlights any landmark events that happen during the race. So it'll highlight any fastest laps, it'll highlight changes in position, it will highlight when people have gone into the pits, and any drivers who have received penalties will also be listed here with the penalty that they have also received. So it's just kind of more information for the director to feed off of and choose what kind of action and who to be viewing at what point during the race, essentially just to try and help them, and also point the broadcaster in the right direction as to what kind of stuff they should be commentating on. So that is a overview of the director and also broadcaster suites. But what I'll do is let this gameplay here in the background play out for another 30 seconds to a minute or so, where I was directing and we also had a broadcaster, both of us commentating on this league race, so you guys can get an idea as to how the systems work when actually being used in action and what the systems are actually capable of. I'll have the broadcaster view up there alongside the director view, so you can see the two side by side as I'm directing and how that impacts the broadcaster as well. If you have any comments or questions on the video, please leave them down in the comment section below. I'll try and get back to you as soon as I possibly can. But otherwise, thank you very much for watching this episode, guys. Hopefully I shall catch you again in the next one. But in the meantime, have fun, stay safe and take care.
But Zenvo is getting a great run in that Mercedes AMG, going past the Lamborghini, unless the Lamborghini's got some great top speed to bounce back with. He's going to start back into the slipstream to try and get some speed back, and of course this straight is long enough for you to really have time to do that. It's not necessarily a good thing to be behind at the start of the straight. It doesn't mean you're going to be ahead at the end of it, but it looks pretty good for the Mercedes, remaining side by side. That way, the Ace is not giving up and he's on the curb a little bit. However, they survived this one. Mercedes, this Mercedes touching the grass slightly, but ADS actually hangs on from Zenvo, who still will have a run though, side by side, going on to the main straight as well. There's 3 cars going into the pit lane from the top 7. which means these guys are going to at least temporarily gain some places. Is Zenvo going to be able to brake later on the outside? Yes, he is. Braking down into the racing line, and ADA's having to relieve the position in the end.
Yep, he managed to make the apex as well. Very, very fantastic. Very, very good driving by those two guys there, managing to go side by side through that final section and avoid making contact. They came very, very close at one point. But yeah, a whole bunch of guys are in the pits. Leon, the sick one, is the first. Bao is also in there. Jardier and also Suomi. Suomi we saw have that contact or the spin with earlier on, and then also the contact with the wall, so he's probably preparing some damage there. Jardier seems to have gotten running. He's going to be rejoining the track back in 11th position.